One of the most controversial studies on cholesterol published last year by Harvard MD Nick Norwitz and Dave Feldman has since been retracted. It's just no longer in the journal, and instead of backing down, the authors have instead decided to double down, so much so that they're going to make a documentary on their life-changing study.
What if we take a look at healthy people and see if cholesterol matters the same?
Now, if you're not aware of this study, you might be living under a rock, but that's okay. I've made a whole video on what were the initial many flaws of this study when it first came out. But essentially, to sum it up, this Keto-CTA trial set out to prove that healthy people on a low-carb ketogenic diet with sky-high levels of LDL cholesterol can have minimal plaque progression. It was designed as a feel-good about your sky-high cholesterol study as long as you're metabolically healthy. And despite significant methodological flaws, patients had a rapid 18.8 millimeters cubed rate of plaque progression on average, which the authors didn't even disclose.
What they found is that the rate of progression of cardiovascular disease in this cohort of patients was basically as fast as any cohort of patients that's ever been studied in terms of progression of subclinical atherosclerosis.
So in many ways, the study ended up proving the exact same thing it set out to disprove. It provided even more evidence that hyperlipidemia has a strong association with atherosclerosis. The authors were essentially put in a corner. What do you do when your data essentially contradicts the point you're trying to make? Well, they retracted their paper. Now, obviously, they can't blame themselves or they would lose credibility, so this was instead delegated to the AI software they used known as Cleerly. How did they do that? Well, the authors conveniently sent their scans to two other AI software companies, Heartflow and Qangio. It also subsequently surfaced that the initial Cleerly results were unblinded. I'll explain what that means in a second, and some participants sent their scans independently to Cleerly for a blinded result. Now, as you can clearly see on the graph, sorry I had to, all these other scans included the unblinded analysis have a much slower progression. So what is the truth? Well, here's Nick Norwitz's initial argument.
The clearly unblinded scans are not reliable. So to review, scans were unblinded. That's inappropriate, they wouldn't repeat. Multiple different data sets, including a blinded Cleerly data set, the Heartflow data set, and the Qangio, largely agreed with each other and reviewed Cleerly. So after all that, it's very clear why the initial results in terms of plaque progression numbers, the non-calcified plaque volume, as published on April 7th, are not reliable and why we moved for retraction.
Now, one point I will agree with is that the degree of plaque progression is far higher in Cleerly than in Heartflow or Qangio. I'm physically unable to dispute that. However, I wouldn't extrapolate to their same conclusion. There appears to be this ongoing insinuation through podcasts that this difference is purely due to an unblinded analysis. But that doesn't sit right with me. Something's off, and here's why. Blinding is this process used in various studies to minimize human bias in interpretation. It's typically in randomized control trials where knowledge of who is and who isn't receiving a particular intervention can influence your subjective assessment of the outcome. For instance, if you know this person's on drug X, you may interpret their result more favorably. But this was a prospective observational study with no intervention or control group. And secondly, the analysis was performed using automated software, not a human. Whether Cleerly, Qangio, Heartflow, unless the algorithm has specifically been fed contextual information like LDL levels in the diet group, which itself would be a serious methodological flaw, it cannot be biased by a lack of blinding in the same way a human assessor can. Even if there were minor human inputs, this would not explain a threefold difference in plaque progression, which again, just to repeat, conveniently seemed to happen after the authors received significant backlash on social media for an initially undisclosed significant progression in non-calcified plaque volume. Again, it might just be me, but something just does not seem quite right about this. Another argument that the authors, particularly Norwitz, seems to make to bolster their argument is that Heartflow and Qangio show similar results, and we are therefore made to conclude that these new results must be legitimate. However, on closer inspection of the data, this conclusion seems premature. Indeed, the only point of agreement between these two scans is the median absolute growth of plaque, which is conveniently what you see on the graph, but this shows nothing about the spread or reliability of the data. If we look at the percentage change in non-calcified plaque volume, the results differ substantially, and if these results were truly reproducible, you'd expect consistency here as well, because percentage change is just a normalized version of growth. And yes, absolutely, as the caption here says, I am wondering how these values can be so drastically different. An even greater issue arises when you look at the raw data. Not only are the distributions different, but the sample sizes don't match. There were 94 patients in Heartflow and 99 in Qangio. Could it be that 5 scans were conveniently excluded from Heartflow to arrive at a similar median value? Unless an alternative explanation is provided, the critique in me can only assume the worst. Beyond that, the number of patients showing plaque progression is 52% in Heartflow, 82% in Qangio, and the mean plaque growth differs substantially. So what we're left with is a superficial similarity in median, whilst every other meaningful metric tells a completely different story, suggesting that this isn't reproducibility, it's selective reporting dressed up as agreement. Now we go into the next part of the video, and this really is the central claim of the Keto-CTA trial. And it's the argument that ApoB and LDL did not predict plaque progression in their cohort. And at first glance, this looks like a direct challenge to many decades of cardiovascular research, but when you unpack how this study was done and designed, that conclusion falls apart very quickly. So let's go through this. The first issue I have with this study is the population itself. To even be included in the study, participants needed an LDL of at least 190 milligrams per deciliter, or around 4.9 millimoles per liter, which roughly places one in the top 1% of the population. So what you're looking at here is not a normal distribution of LDL, but an extremely right-shifted cohort where everyone is already in a very high exposure range, and I think this random post on Twitter summarizes this argument quite well. Now, Nick Norwitz, the primary author of the paper, has a decent response to this, saying that to make the analogy make sense, we would have to imagine that the distribution of human heights ranges from 7 feet to 20 feet, and proceeds to copy and paste this LDL distribution spread shown on the screen. But again, this completely misses the point. Range restriction isn't about how wide your values are, it's about whether you've captured the full biological spectrum of exposure. And the reality is the Keto-CTA trial couldn't have done that because the very inclusion criteria mandates LDL levels in the top 1% of the population, as I've already mentioned. And going back to Norwitz's analogy, I think it proves the exact opposite of what he's trying to argue. I don't think there would be a meaningful difference in basketball performance between someone that's 7 foot and 20 foot, given that the hoop is only 10 feet tall. But indeed, there's a massive difference between someone that's 5 foot and 7 foot. Now, am I saying that there's a saturation effect at very high LDL levels? The honest answer is I don't know, and neither do the current guidelines, irrespective of what's mentioned about a dose-response relationship. Because if you look at the studies that influence the current guidelines or conclusion, most of the interventional trial data looks at LDL alterations of up to 2 millimoles per liter, and yet this study has an inclusion criteria more than double that. So it's not disputing the lipid hypothesis, it's operating in a range that hasn't been studied and drawing conclusions that the data isn't equipped to support. Now to the second point regarding this so-called lack of association, the study is underpowered to detect the relationship it claims to test. Essentially, you have a 1-year follow-up study in a small subgroup of 100 participants using CT-CTA derived plaque measurements, which have known substantial variability between different AI platforms, as I discussed earlier. When your signal, which is true plaque progression at 12 months, is small, and your noise, measurement variability, segmental differences, and reconstruction algorithms is high, you've essentially created a scenario where true associations get washed out. So the lack of correlation is entirely consistent with a study that is simply not designed with respect to duration, sample size, or measurement precision to detect that relationship. And now to my final point, the statistical analysis to demonstrate this conclusion is not actually even available in the paper.
Many of the statistical models required to support these claims are missing from the paper. They're just not reported. They state conclusions for analyses they never show. Where is the change in NCPV to baseline LDLC model? It's not reported. Where are any of the models with total plaque score as the outcome? Not reported. A chart of TPS versus ApoB model is even shown in the central illustration here, but the model output, it's not reported, so we can't verify anything here.
Furthermore, they omitted crucial variables and confounders such as age and sex, which are known determinants of plaque progression, even though they were available in the dataset.
Their conclusion isn't ApoB has no effect, it's ApoB looked like it had no effect when other important factors were ignored. That's classic omitted variable bias.
But obviously the authors need to have some interesting result, so they shift your focus to plaque predicts plaque, which is a bit strange as they looked at the same person's plaque a year later. Of course it predicts it, it's just within person persistence of plaque. It's like rust on a car predicting rust on a car a year later. Well, not exactly, but say there's an independent variable, such as being male, which causes you to have more plaque. That same factor will be there the next year, resulting in more plaque. And because the authors haven't adjusted for any confounders, this association just becomes made apparent. However, there's nothing meaningful clinically in this absolutely common sense observation. It's simply there to contrast to ApoB not predicting plaque growth, but ultimately you're comparing a baseline data set to a risk factor, which are two entirely different things. And really, it's not that hard to do this study properly if you want to see if ApoB or LDL cholesterol is causal in atherosclerosis, especially with the current pharmacology out there. You could simply put half the patients on an aggressive PCSK9 inhibitor for some time and compare actual cardiovascular endpoint outcomes such as mortality, need for PCI revascularization, rather than plaque on a CT-CTA. But the authors wouldn't do that because they're all low-carb keto dieters with a preformed perception of what they believe is healthy. And the entire point of the study is to reaffirm this. It's almost like a conflict of interest, not financial, but personal. And another one of these so-called I know everything experts is Paul Saladino, who's this huge proponent of the carnivore diet. I've made an entire video on him debunking his claims, which you can check out somewhere here. I'll see you in the next one.